The cameras were rolling. Blair was ready to go live. Then the studio doors locked, and her mother served her a legal shutdown. "I built this place before you learned to lie in filters," Margaret said. "You erased me from the frame, so I bought the whole gallery. Now the daughter's brand is collapsing, and the mother they mocked is the only one left in the picture. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." Everyone smiled for the camera, but I wasn't allowed in the frame. I wasn't aesthetic enough for her social feed. Everyone smiled for the camera, but Margaret wasn't allowed in the frame. She stood at the edge of the rented photography studio, her hands folded gently in front of her, watching Blair and Ethan pose under high-end softboxes that glowed like fake moonlight. The room was cool and smelled of lavender sanitizer and expensive hair product. Blair adjusted the silk tie around Ethan's neck, then stepped back and gave him a once-over like she was styling a mannequin, not a husband. "Pull in your stomach a bit," she said through her glossed teeth. "We're going for heritage meets modern minimalism, not dad bod era." Ethan chuckled nervously and did as told. The photographer, a young woman in combat boots and a plaid flannel, glanced at Margaret. "Should we bring your mother in for the generational shot?" There was a sharp silence. Blair turned her head slowly. "Oh," she said with a voice so sugar-coated it cut, "that won't be necessary." Margaret looked down at her blouse. Pale blue cotton, neatly pressed. A brooch pinned over the heart, slightly tarnished but meaningful. Blair continued, "We're keeping it curated. You know, cleaner, cohesive. Grandma's outfit might throw off the palette." The photographer blinked. Ethan looked away. Margaret smiled softly, nodded, and stepped back without protest. "Of course," she said. "You know best." But her hands didn't unclench until she was back in the hallway. An hour later, Margaret stood by the vending machine in the lobby, watching as the shoot laughter echoed faintly down the corridor. She fed in a crumpled dollar, pressed C4, and waited as the machine rattled before spitting out a lukewarm ginger ale. The drink fizzed quietly as she cracked it open. Her reflection in the machine's scratched glass looked tired, but steady. She sat on a bench near the window, the evening sun casting gold across the floor tiles. She could almost pretend the sting in her chest was just the carbonation. Her phone buzzed. "Blair, thanks again for understanding. We'll send you the final pics, though. You looked cute today?" Margaret didn't reply. Instead, she pulled out her wallet and removed a yellowed envelope tucked behind old receipts. The handwriting was familiar, broad, looping cursive that still felt warm to the touch. She hadn't opened it in 20 years. The seal crackled as she slid out the letter. Her late husband's voice seemed to whisper through the folds of time. "Maggie, if you're reading this, something must have happened. Maybe you're standing somewhere you helped build, feeling invisible. If so, remember, we didn't just invest money into that studio, we invested sweat, dreams. And I left you a clause in the purchase contract, just in case you ever needed it. You never needed much, but I needed you. Love, always. Daniel." Beneath the letter, a faded copy of the original studio deed was stapled to a page marked Clause 9B, Future Ownership Transfer. Her breath caught. The clause wasn't symbolic. It was binding. Margaret stared at the document as if it might evaporate in her hands. It didn't. The door to the studio burst open again. Blair and Ethan stepped out laughing, arms full of props and good lighting. Margaret stood slowly. Blair passed without a glance. Ethan gave a small, guilt-slicked nod before looking away. Margaret's voice was calm as the wind outside when she made the call. She held the phone to her ear. It rang once. Then, "Yes, hello. This is Margaret Holloway. I'd like to activate the purchase clause. Immediately." Margaret dials a number. "I'd like to activate the purchase clause." She didn't know the studio she posed in had once belonged to my husband. She didn't know the studio she posed in had once belonged to my husband, and she never asked. The air inside the studio office felt colder than the polished concrete floors suggested. Margaret stood near the reception desk, holding the faded contract like it was a relic dug out from beneath years of dust and disregard. A woman emerged from the back, Slim, silver blonde bob, tortoiseshell glasses, and the kind of tired grace that comes from years in creative work. Her name tag read Isabel Rains, General Manager. When her eyes landed on the document in Margaret's hand, they widened. "Oh my God," she said softly, stepping closer. "Where did you get that?" Margaret offered a faint smile. "Clause 9B. My husband and I signed it. With the former owner, Daniel Holloway. Maybe you remember him?" Isabel blinked rapidly, emotion flashing across her face. "I do. Daniel was a good man. Helped keep this place afloat when no one else would. He always said it was a home for vision, not vanity." Margaret's smile tightened. "And now?" Isabel exhaled. "Now it's a set piece, rented by influencers more than artists. Everyone wants the vibe, not the craft." She paused. "You're Margaret. He used to talk about you all the time." The office smelled like dried eucalyptus and old film reels. The walls were lined with vintage cameras and framed black and white shots from the early days, long before ring lights and filters. Margaret's eyes scanned the room until she found a photo on the far wall. It was them. She and Daniel, side by side, 25 years younger. Dust on their clothes, sweat on their brows, mid-laugh as they painted the studio walls themselves. She touched the glass frame lightly. "I thought that ownership clause dissolved when Daniel passed," she said, still looking at the photo. "It should have," Isabel admitted, "but the paperwork never cleared. He never filed a full transfer. And according to our last review, the clause is still valid. You're listed as a co-investor with a pending stake." Margaret turned slowly. "Pending?" "The board's been restructuring," Isabel explained. "And we've been under review. New regulations, new investors trying to sniff around. But if you push this clause now, you can activate it. Take temporary operational control until legal transition completes." Margaret stood still for a moment, absorbing it. The scent of varnished wood and camera polish hung in the air like memory. She wasn't just being offered a visit to the past, she was being offered a key. "What do you want to do?" Isabel asked quietly. Margaret took a long breath. Her voice was clear. "I want access. I want to know who's using this place, what they're doing in Daniel's name." Isabel nodded. "Then let's get you reinstated. Quietly." They walked to a small conference room in the back. Glass walls, a long table, and a sense of history humming beneath the minimalist furniture. Isabel placed a folder on the table and opened it. Inside was a temporary operating agreement, just a few pages but heavy with consequence. Margaret read every line. Her hands didn't shake. A knock interrupted them. A junior assistant stepped in, holding a box of white roses tied with velvet ribbon. "For the Holloways," she said. "Blair sent them ahead of next week's shoot, said she wanted the set to look soft and generational." Margaret looked down at the flowers. Pristine, perfect, impersonal. "She sends roses to rooms she deletes people from," she murmured. Isabel watched her. Margaret picked up the pen and signed. Margaret signs a temporary operating agreement, quietly reclaiming access. Blair curated her life in filters. I lived mine in silence, but not for long. Blair curated her life in filters. Lighting always soft, captions always sweet. Even her cruelty came wrapped in pastel quotes and inspirational hashtags. Margaret, on the other hand, lived her truth in silence. In wrinkles she'd earned. In stitches she never boasted about. But silence, she had decided, was no longer her brand. That morning, her hands folded gently in her lap, Margaret sat quietly in the observation lounge of the studio, a glass-paneled room just above the main floor. She wore a charcoal cardigan, gold studs, and an expression even more neutral than the modern artwork behind her. Down below, Blair was in full performance mode. "Can we please get better lighting on this backdrop?" Blair snapped, pointing at a large white canvas. "I look like I slept in someone's basement." The crew, mostly young 20-somethings in black, scrambled around her. A makeup artist held up blotting sheets like a peace offering. One intern nearly tripped over a ring light stand trying to reposition it. Blair didn't say thank you. Margaret watched it all unfold through the glass. The girl she raised had become a woman she wouldn't follow online, let alone recognize in person. Just an hour earlier, Blair had posted a story to her followers. Biggest brand shoot of the year. Can't wait to show you all this content. Generational grace meets modern glam. Next gen legacy. Shocker studio queen. Margaret had watched the story alone, then slipped her phone into her purse and headed to the studio, not as Blair's mother, but as a silent investor. That's what Isabel had written on the guest list. The security badge clipped to her coat now held more power than her last 20 birthdays combined. Blair spun dramatically under the lights now, lips pursed, arms raised. "Ethan, angle your jaw toward the left. You always give side face best." Ethan obeyed without a word. Margaret noticed his suit didn't quite fit right today. His shoulders were slumped, and the smile he wore for the camera was paper thin. When one of the stylists handed Blair a pair of vintage gloves, she laughed. No, these look like something my mom would wear. We're not channeling thrift store trauma today." Margaret didn't flinch. She just wrote something in the notebook she'd brought, a private ledger of all the public humiliations. Later, in the studio's break room, dimly lit, stocked with granola bars and half-empty energy drinks, Margaret sat across from Isabel again. "She talks to people like they're props," Margaret said quietly, stirring her tea. Isabel nodded. "That's been an ongoing issue. We've had 4 assistants quit since January. One left in tears after she was told to lose 10 pounds for a better hallway aesthetic." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "That wasn't in the brand deal." "No," Isabel said, "but Blair's learned how to make cruelty look contractual." She pulled a slim tablet from her bag and passed it across the table. "You asked for access to logs. I ran a full usage report." Margaret scrolled through the on-screen data, studio rental schedules, brand bookings, overtime charges, and a long list of custom requests made under Blair's name, some highlighted in red. "Unpaid invoices," Isabel said quietly. 12 of them, almost 9 months behind, but she keeps booking under Ethan's name or dummy LLCs. Margaret's jaw tightened. "She says the exposure she brings is worth more than the rental," Isabel added bitterly. Margaret closed the tablet. Her hands were still steady. "Forward me copies," she said. "All of it. I want every receipt." Isabel hesitated. "What are you planning?" "Nothing. Yet." Margaret stood slowly. "But if she wants the spotlight, she'd better pay for the electricity." As she stepped back onto the main floor, Blair twirled once more for the camera. "God, I love this place. It just gets me, you know?" Margaret walked past without a word, but Blair didn't even notice. She was too busy being seen. Margaret sees Blair has unpaid studio rental dues. She posted about kindness, but I saw her yell at a pregnant assistant. She posted a reel about compassion that morning, soft piano music, a candle flickering in the background, and a voiceover whispering, "Kindness is strength in satin." 2 hours later, she screamed at a pregnant assistant because a tripod wasn't straight. Margaret heard every word from the observation room above. "Are you blind or just incompetent?" Blair snapped, pacing the set in stilettos like she was stalking prey. "I said overhead, not from the side. Why is that hard?" The girl, barely 22, with a visible baby bump and a clipboard clutched to her chest, mumbled something apologetic. Her face had gone sheet white. "I don't care if your ankles are swollen," Blair added, voice rising. "You don't get sympathy if you can't follow a simple layout?" The photographer froze mid-adjustment. One lighting tech stopped walking entirely. The live stream, still rolling on a mounted iPhone, caught the tail end of the moment. Comments began pouring in. Callie Glam, "Wait, is she yelling at a pregnant girl?" And Kazia Lux, "Ugh." The audio, "This is awkward." As truth filter, not the kindness queen turning into a tyrant, Blair's manager hissed from off-camera, "Mute her mic now." But it was too late. Margaret leaned forward in her chair, her knuckles pressing against the glass as she watched the girl retreat into the hallway, shoulders hunched, hands shaking. She dropped the clipboard near the exit door and disappeared down the back corridor. Margaret reached for her phone. She didn't call. She typed, "Anonymous. You have options. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Check the labor code. You're protected. Studio management is aware." She hit send and watched the message disappear into the digital dark. Then she whispered to herself, Not on my floor. Later that afternoon, Isabel met Margaret in the studio's archive room, a quiet, forgotten space filled with contract binders, old invoices, and the scent of ink and storage dust. "There's something you should see," Isabel said, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside was a printed offer sheet, unsigned but dangerously close. "Someone's trying to buy the studio," Isabel explained. "Not officially. They're doing it through a proxy LLC, Ravenna Concepts, but I followed the paperwork trail." She flipped the last page. The listed contact, Blair Holloway. Margaret didn't speak at first. Her eyes scanned the numbers, the land rights, the attached modernization proposal. It was clean, quiet, and predatory. "She's trying to purchase the same space she shot me out of," Margaret murmured. "From underneath my own feet." Isabel nodded. "We've seen her name on inquiries. She wants to gut the archive wing, install private influencer suites, custom vanity booths, branded glass doors." "Of course she does." Margaret closed the file and opened her purse. Out came a slim envelope with a red stamp. "Injunction request, hold of sale, Section 9. B. Active." Isabel's eyebrows lifted. "You already file." "This morning," Margaret said. "It won't be enough to stop her forever, but it will stall her. She won't know why." "She'll think it's a glitch in the system," Isabel mused. "Good," Margaret replied. "Let her try to rebrand a space she doesn't legally own." Later, as the sun slipped across the wide studio windows, Blair posed again, this time alone, draped in silk and framed by a set designed to look candid. She tossed her hair, smiling like a woman untouched by consequence. Margaret stood in the hallway, one hand resting on the cool metal railing. Her other held a receipt. The assistant had emailed it. A time-stamped clip of the abuse. Unedited, unfiltered, hashtags can't erase hypocrisy. But facts leave bruises that don't heal with filters. Margaret places a legal block on the sale. "She called my wardrobe poor. I called my lawyer rich. She once laughed at my shoes, said they looked like they came with a soup kitchen. Today I watched her face fall while my lawyer clicked open a briefcase that probably cost more than her last 2 collaborations combined. It was a Thursday morning, sharp and clear, the kind of day Blair might call perfect for content. But there were no cameras in the studio office that day, only silence, tension, and a leather briefcase placed squarely on the table by Margaret's attorney, Gene Franklin. He was tall, gray-suited, and impeccably calm. The kind of calm that only comes when you know your side is already winning. Margaret sat beside him, hands folded neatly, her brooch gleaming like a quiet medal of war. Across the table, Isabel handed over the most recent portfolio review file. "Everything's been cross-checked," she said. "The clause is valid. We traced all silent investments from the original deed and reviewed amendments filed posthumously under Daniel Holloway's estate." Jean opened the folder. "And?" Isabel's voice didn't waver. 51%, held in Margaret's name, unchallenged. She's the legal majority stakeholder. The words hung in the air for a moment, soft but seismic. Margaret blinked once, then nodded slowly. "Let's make it official." At 10:42 a.m., Blair arrived for her pre-launch walkthrough. She wore a camel-toned trench, oversized sunglasses, and the fake urgency of someone important running late. "Sorry, I had to push my infrared facial. My skin's just been so reactive lately with all the light tests." She didn't notice Margaret in the corner of the lobby. Or maybe she did, but mistook her for someone who still belonged in the shadows. "Is the green room ready?" Blair asked one of the stylists without waiting for an answer. "And someone needs to check the mirror filters. Last week it gave me texture." Margaret stepped forward. "Blair?" Blair turned, then blinked. "Oh, Mom, what are you doing here?" Jean stepped into view. "Good morning. I'm Gene Franklin, legal counsel to Margaret Holloway." Blair's smile faltered. "I'm sorry? You've been using studio space under multiple unofficial bookings," Jean said, handing her a document. "This is a cease and desist, effective immediately. Further use of the premises without clearance constitutes trespassing." Blair stared at the paper. "This has to be a joke." "It isn't," Margaret said softly. "I'm reclaiming ownership. As of this morning, I'm majority holder of this studio." Blair's laugh came out thin, nervous. You're kidding. This place is part of my brand. You can't just show up and— You've never legally paid for its use, Jean interjected, and your name appears on several unpaid vendor accounts. Under these conditions, your event can't proceed. What event? Blair snapped, defensive. Jean opened a second envelope. Your brand shoot, Heritage by Holloway, booked under a proxy company and still awaiting studio clearance. Margaret looked at her daughter. This woman who had once been a little girl holding a glitter pen and asking if she looked fancy. Now she looked furious, not heartbroken, not confused, just angry. That shoot is tomorrow, Blair whispered, voice hardening. You're seriously doing this now? Margaret didn't flinch. You scheduled over people. You edited your story to make space for yourself. I'm just reframing the truth. Blair stepped back like the words had weight, like she finally saw something behind Margaret that hadn't existed in her curated, cropped version of reality. Strength, ownership, legacy. The next day, 7:12 a.m. Staff arrived to find the studio's main doors locked, the set lights dark, and a red folder taped neatly to the glass. Notice of temporary shutdown. All unauthorized events suspended pending stakeholder review. Issued by M. Holloway Blair receives the studio shutdown notice on the day of her biggest brand shoot. She cropped me out. I bought the frame. She cropped me out, erased my presence from the family shoot like I was clutter in the background. So I bought the frame. And now I decide what gets displayed. The shutdown hit Blair's feed like a sledgehammer. A selfie video dropped at noon. She wore a sweatshirt with "Good Vibes Only" printed across the chest. No makeup, tear-glossed eyes, the kind of lighting meant to say vulnerability, but still flattering. I never thought my own family would weaponize ownership against me. She sniffed to her 312,000 followers. I've always stood for empowerment, but this is a targeted silencing. I'm literally being shut down because I'm successful. It's cancel culture. It's ageism. It's jealousy. She pressed a tissue against the corner of her eye for dramatic pause. I hope the truth comes out. I really do. It did. But not the version she thought. In the days following the shutdown, Margaret moved through the studio like a woman unburdened. There were no film crews, no ring lights, no glitter trails of curated content. Just her, clipboards in hand, walking the echoing corridors Daniel once called sacred. With Isabel's help, she began rewriting the studio's mission from the inside out. No more influencer booking privileges without contract review. No shoots allowed without fair pay for staff. No interns working unpaid under exposure-based mentorship. And on the bulletin board by the staff lounge, Margaret tacked up a single line on official letterhead: exploit no one, not even the quiet ones. MH. Then the DMS started. Anonymous. Grateful. Raw. I quit after she made me cry in the bathroom. Thank you for stepping in. We weren't allowed to sit down unless the shoot wrapped. She told me my skin was too warm for her brand palette. I'm mixed race. Some messages came from accounts with no names, others from burner profiles, but each one carried the weight of someone who'd felt invisible and now saw proof that someone had seen them. Margaret didn't respond. She didn't repost them. She just printed them out, one by one, lined them in a folder she labeled Lens Stories The Unseen. It sat on her desk now, just beneath the original studio deed. Late one evening, the studio floor was nearly empty. The golden hour sun cut through the blinds in long, patient beams. Margaret stood in Studio C, where old photo props had been pulled out of storage, aged leather chairs, real wood backdrops, hand-painted scrolls no one used anymore. She placed her palm against the wall, remembering when she and Daniel rolled that paint on together, laughing about how they didn't know mood boards would ever be a thing. Feels right, she whispered. Behind her, the door opened. Soft steps, familiar ones. Mom. Margaret turned. Ethan stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes unreadable. I just came from Blair, he said. She's spiraling. Says you're trying to destroy her. Margaret said nothing. He looked around the space, slowly. What are you doing? She took her time answering. I'm restoring something that never should have been rebranded. He exhaled. She's my wife. I'm your mother. The silence between them stretched, thick and awkward, the kind only people with shared grief and conflicting loyalty know how to inhabit. She's pregnant, Ethan said finally, voice cracking. Margaret's eyebrows lifted just slightly. Not surprise, calculation. She didn't mention that when she filed to purchase the studio behind my back. She's scared, Ethan said. This studio, it's everything to her. Margaret stepped toward him, slow and sure. This place was everything to your father. It's legacy to me. What she did to it? That was branding. Ethan looked down, jaw clenched. Doesn't a baby deserve peace? He asked. Margaret studied him. Then don't teach it how to erase people, she said. Ethan confronts her. What are you doing? He said I should let it go. I asked if he meant my dignity too. He said I should let it go. I asked if he meant my dignity too, or just his convenience. Margaret stood behind her desk in the office Daniel once called the war room. The hardwood still bore faint scuff marks from the wheels of his drafting stool. His old fountain pen sat untouched in a glass box beside a dried peony, the kind he used to bring her every third Friday no matter what. Now she gripped the edge of the desk like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Ethan stood across from her, one hand gripping the strap of his leather messenger bag, the other buried in his pocket. Mom, he said, not quite pleading yet but circling it, this has gone far enough. Margaret didn't blink. Gone far enough for who? For us, for Blair, for our family's image. Ah, she cut in, voice like velvet over glass. There it is again. Image. Ethan ran a hand through his hair and looked down, as if the floor might help him gather the courage his spine lacked. You're making her look bad. The internet thinks she's being held accountable? Margaret's words sliced clean. Is that what the internet calls it these days? He stepped forward. You're publicly embarrassing us. Margaret leaned in slightly, her tone dipping low. I fed you off grocery coupons for 10 years while working night shifts and holding back tears at PTA meetings because you missed your father so much you couldn't sleep. I sewed patches on your elbows so you wouldn't feel poor at school. I gave you the shirt off my back, and then some. Ethan's jaw clenched. You always bring that up. Because you always forget, she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. The weight of her calm was sharper than any shout. You married someone who called me outdated, who edited me out of photos, who sneered at my shoes when I showed up to your wedding in the only pair I could still walk comfortably in. He flinched. She's pregnant, he said suddenly, like it might earn him mercy. Margaret stared at him, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, her face softened, but only slightly. Then, grow up before you become a father. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was seismic. You think this is about revenge? Margaret asked after a long pause. It's about reclamation, about saying no out loud for the first time in 30 years. She's scared, Ethan said, more defensively than empathetically. She's entitled, Margaret corrected. There's a difference. Ethan's shoulders slumped, and for the first time in their entire conversation he looked small. The boy she used to drag out of the rain when he forgot his umbrella. The boy she used to read bedtime stories to, because even after a 10-hour shift, she never missed a chapter. She's not evil, he said softly. She's just trying. Margaret stepped closer, eyes searching his face. Then let her try without hurting others, without unpaid labor, without treating legacy like a social campaign. He swallowed, emotion finally rising to the surface. And you? He asked. What are you trying to be now? Margaret looked past him, to the photo wall she'd just installed. Real portraits, not filters. Women in their 50s, 60s, 70s, smiling, fierce, unretouched. Honest, she said. I'm trying to be honest. That evening, after Ethan had left in silence, Margaret returned to her room above the studio, temporarily converted into her personal office quarters while renovations continued. A box sat on the table. No label, no note. She opened it slowly. Inside, a full makeover kit, serum, creams, brow shaper, hair tint, branded with pink cursive fonts that read, "You deserve to look the part." At the bottom, a printout of her face, cropped from an old photo, circled in red, a sticky note stuck to it. "Let us help you feel young again." She stood still for a long moment, then picked up the serum, turned it in her hand, and whispered, almost to herself, "Or maybe I'll just look like me." Margaret receives a package. It's her own makeover kit, anonymously sent. "They mocked my look. I wore silence like silk." They mocked my look, called it frumpy, outdated, even pitiful, but today I wore silence like silk, and let the light speak for itself. The studio buzzed with a different kind of energy now. No influencer playlist, no vanity countdowns, just the clean hum of intention. Margaret sat beneath a cascade of natural light pouring from the skylight in Studio B, the same room she had once mopped after long winter nights. Now, a stylist hovered beside her with a palette of fabrics, muted creams, deep violets, tailored charcoal. "Everything here is yours to choose from," said Simone, the studio's newly hired in-house artist, a young black woman with soft hands and a firmer sense of style. "I've admired your work since the archives came back online. You've got lines in your story. I'm just here to help underline them." Margaret smiled, tightly but genuinely. "Just don't make me look like I'm trying to chase a youth I've already outgrown." Simone laughed. "No one's chasing. We're standing still and letting the light find us." The final look was simple. A structured dove-gray wrap jacket with subtle stitching across the shoulders, a pair of wide-leg trousers in soft wool, and Margaret's own brooch, polished, proud, pinned above her heart. She caught her reflection in the dressing mirror. She didn't look younger. She looked true. An hour later, the journalist from Lumen City Life arrived, young, enthusiastic, holding a notebook too clean to be real. Her name was Carrie. "I've covered a lot of local rebrands," Carrie said, "but yours is different. You're not just reviving a studio, you're rewriting what legacy looks like." Margaret sipped her tea, the steam coiling against her cheek like breath. "I'm not rewriting," she said. "I'm finally publishing the draft I kept hidden under someone else's cover." Carrie smiled. "Can I quote that?" "You just did." The interview was still mid-sentence when the front doors slammed open. The air shifted. High heels clacked down the corridor, sharp, angry, too fast to be anything but deliberate. Blair. She burst into the studio like she still owned it, sunglasses too dark for indoor lighting, phone gripped. In one hand, her expression already loaded with accusation. "Seriously?" she barked, eyes scanning the scene. "A makeover shoot? A feature interview? Are you out of your mind?" Carrie froze. Simone stepped back. Even the camera assistants slowly lowered their equipment. Margaret stood calmly. "You're not on the calendar," she said without looking up. "You erased me," Blair snapped. "You deleted my name from everything, locked me out of the archive login, froze my contracts, and now you're posing in my space like you invented it?" Margaret turned, finally meeting her eyes. "I did help invent it." "You don't get to make this about you," Blair hissed. "This place became what it is because of me. My shoots, my audience, my brand equity." Margaret stepped forward, inches from her now. "You built a brand on other people's backs, and then told them to smile for the camera. I'm just reminding the lens who was here before the filters." Blair scoffed, voice rising. "You don't have the right." Margaret's voice was a whisper that carried like thunder. "I have the paperwork, I have the staff's respect, and I have the receipts, literally." She turned toward the others. "This woman still owes 6 months in unpaid studio rentals, is under internal review for multiple HR complaints, and is currently trespassing." The word hit the air like a trigger. Blair's face contorted. "Fine!" she spat, pointing a trembling hand. "Then you'll hear from my lawyer. You want to talk legacy? Let's see how it holds up in court. I'm suing you. Emotional distress, public defamation, theft of brand identity." She stormed out, heels striking hard enough to echo. No one followed. Carrie sat stunned for a long second, then whispered, Do you still want to continue the interview?" Margaret adjusted her jacket, lifted her chin, and sat back down. Now more than ever. Blair threatens to sue for emotional distress. She wanted to expose me. I gave her the lighting. She wanted to expose me. Call me bitter, irrelevant, weak. But I gave her the lighting instead. Not the soft golden hour glow she loved, but something harsher, cleaner. The kind of light that makes every crack visible. It began quietly. A flash drive slid across a cafe table. A whisper exchanged between Margaret and a podcast producer with a reputation for unveiling glossy secrets. The file was labeled B. Holloway, live shoot recordings, unedited. Inside, hours of audio clips, captured over months by studio assistants and techs too scared to speak up but too hurt to stay silent. Margaret had reviewed them all. Every "you're too fat for my color" story. Every "if you're going to cry, do it in the utility closet." Every "I'm not paying you to take a breath." All layered beneath the public smile of someone who used words like light, empowerment, and intentional living like they were part of a skincare routine. By Friday evening, the episode dropped. Behind the Brand, Season 4, Episode 6, The Studio Queen's Real Voice. Within hours, it cracked the trending charts. Blair Holloway's rep is built on kindness. Our inbox says otherwise. That's how the host opened. Then came the clips. Raw, unfiltered, impossible to spin. "Why is her voice shaking?" one listener tweeted. "She's literally screaming while telling people to breathe through the moment," another replied. By Saturday morning, the hashtag number behind the smile hit 2.7 million impressions. In Studio A, Margaret stood by the large glass windows, watching pedestrians pass beneath a billboard featuring Blair's face. Eyes half closed, captioned, "Peace is your birthright." The irony made her throat tighten, but she said nothing. She just sipped her tea and waited. At 11:43 a.m., a knock. It was Isabel, holding a phone in one hand, her face unreadable. "She's hemorrhaging sponsors," Isabel said flatly. "3 dropped overnight. And..." She paused. Ethan resigned. Margaret turned slowly. From what? From his PR consultancy, the firm managing Blair's contracts. He handed in a letter this morning and walked out. Word is, he didn't tell her first. Margaret's heart didn't exactly swell, but something within her shifted. Not victory, not satisfaction. Maybe just air. "I guess it's never too late to remember who raised you," she murmured. Later that afternoon, Margaret returned to her desk. She opened her laptop and found 2 emails waiting. The first from a local school for creative arts, asking if she'd consider hosting a guest workshop for underprivileged students. The second, from Blair. Subject, "You went too far." Message, "You're destroying my life. You think this makes you strong? You're disgusting. You will regret this." No greeting, no sign-off, just fury in digital ink. Margaret didn't reply. She simply dragged the email into a folder labeled Documentation. Then she opened her Notes app and added a line to her draft statement for the press. "Accountability is not cruelty, it is clarity, and clarity is the only light I'll be working under from now on." By the end of the day, several fashion blogs had picked up the story. One called it the quiet takedown of influencer royalty. Another called Margaret a symbol of anti-performative power. Still, she stayed silent publicly. Let the world catch up on its own. But privately? She walked the hallway lined with new staff portraits, real smiles, diverse faces, no touch-ups. She paused in front of Simone's photo and adjusted the frame, just slightly. Then her phone buzzed, a text from Isabel. "It's official. Lumiere Company just dropped her. The big one. The 5-year deal. Gone." Margaret looked at the message, then at the wall behind her. On it was the quote Daniel once wrote in permanent marker, now framed in gold. "The light always returns to its source. Blair's biggest brand sponsor drops her. For a second, I regretted it all. Then I remembered the studio wall. For a second, she almost regretted it. The press, the podcast, the sponsors pulling out like a tide receding from Blair's carefully arranged shoreline. Then she heard Blair sobbing through the thin wall of Ethan's apartment, the sobs barely muffled, raw and childlike, and Margaret felt something in her chest cave slightly. Not out of pity, out of memory. "Mom, please." Ethan had whispered on the phone that morning, voice cracked and low. "She's not eating. She thinks you've ruined everything. She doesn't even know how to explain it to her mother." "Her mother?" Margaret had asked quietly. "She called her," he said. "She's staying there for now. Blair told her she's never been more humiliated in her life. She cries at everything. She doesn't sleep." The silence on Margaret's end was heavy, almost crushing. "Did she ever cry for the girls she screamed at?" she asked. "People make mistakes," Ethan said. "You're turning them into ruins." "I didn't build the ruins," Margaret replied. "I just took the lens cap off." But still, after the call ended, something sat in Margaret's stomach like cold metal. Was it too much? Had she let her pain speak louder than her principles? She needed clarity, not just the kind you get from headlines and hashtags, but the kind Daniel used to give with just one look. So she went where she hadn't dared in years. His office. The door creaked as she opened it. Daniel's old space had been used for storage since he passed. Stacks of unused frames, tangled cords, a broken swivel chair in the corner. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust and something soft she couldn't quite name. A kind of lingering presence. Margaret walked slowly, brushing her fingers over the old drafting table. There were still pencil smudges in the grain. She touched the light switch and the corner bulb flickered on, buzzing faintly. She sat and saw it. Tucked inside the old typewriter drawer was a folded envelope, yellowing, labeled in his handwriting, "In case you forget who started it." Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, a photo. A black and white shot of her and Daniel standing in front of the studio before it ever opened. The walls hadn't even been painted. She wore jeans and a scarf. He held a clipboard and a thermos. But on the back of the photo, in Daniel's writing, was something more. "Don't let them shame your legacy, Maggie. This wasn't just my dream. It was ours. You didn't build this by accident. You were always the lens. I was just the flash." Her breath caught. She read it again, then again, until the self-doubt melted into something clearer. Stronger, not revenge, not cruelty, continuity. That night, Margaret stood in front of the studio's west wall, where Daniel had once scrawled his first concept sketches in chalk and Sharpie, thinking no one would keep them. She traced the lines with her fingertips. A circle, a roof, a line that read, "Public space, private soul." She whispered to the dark, "They think I inherited this. They don't know I helped pour the foundation." The next morning, she met with a local preservation officer. "I want to apply for historical protection," Margaret said, sliding the paperwork across the desk. "Not just for the structure, for what it meant, for what it still means." The officer blinked. "Are you the founder?" "I'm the co-founder," she said, "and it's time that name gets written back into the frame." He flipped through the documents. "You understand this turns the building into a cultural site. Commercial rights get reviewed. No influencer remodels, no branded redesigns." Margaret smiled. "That's the point." Back at the studio, Isabel stood in the hallway holding a small file. "We just got confirmation," she said, handing it over. Margaret took the papers. The preservation request had been officially accepted for review, under the applicant name Margaret Holloway. Margaret applies for a historical preservation grant in her name. She built a feed. I built a foundation. She built a feed, square by square, filter by filter. But now the squares were crumbling, and no amount of glow, enhancing presets could hide the cracks. Margaret, meanwhile, had built something else, something slower, something harder, something no algorithm could erase. Blair's IG Live began at exactly 8 p.m., the hour she once reserved for skincare routines and faux cozy bedtime chats. But tonight, the lighting was off. Her mascara slightly smudged. The carefully placed healing crystals on her nightstand looked like props at a crime scene. "I don't know what you want from me," she said, voice quivering with performative exhaustion. "I gave everything. I worked so hard. And now I'm being dragged for being ambitious, for protecting my brand, for setting boundaries." The camera shook slightly as she leaned in. "My own family sabotaged me. They've weaponized legal loopholes just to humiliate me." This isn't empowerment. It's elder resentment. It's—" Her voice cracked. Jealousy. Her lower lip trembled, but her followers weren't buying it anymore. The comment section started slowly. Lucy Visions. "Girl, you yelled at a pregnant intern. You filmed it." hbrit.moss. "Accountability is not betrayal. Grow up." Studio Inside. "Did you ever even apologize to your staff?" Truth Filter. "Did your mom build the studio? 'Cause she's acting like the adult." Heart stopped, like slowed. The chat spiraled. Blair blinked at the screen, confused by the sudden dip in support. She tried to regain control. I need grace, not criticism." But grace, Margaret knew, isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. That same night, inside the studio's restored archive lounge, Margaret stood behind a podium beside Isabel. A small group of artists, former interns, and donors filled the room, sipping coffee and flipping through new brochures titled "The Holloway Legacy Scholarship Creative Grants for Women, 50+ Reclaiming Their Voice Through Art," a new initiative, fully funded. "Some stories begin late," Margaret said to the room, "but they still matter. We're here to amplify the voices who were once silenced, including our own." She didn't say Blair's name once. She didn't have to. The message was in the wall of portraits now lining the back room, women of every age, every shade, standing proud in thrifted fabrics and unapologetic wrinkles. No retouching, no slogans, just presence. Ethan waited until the event ended. He stood outside under the orange glow of the vintage street lamp Daniel had installed years ago. His hands were stuffed deep in his coat pockets, his eyes darting nervously between the sidewalk and the second-floor window where Margaret's silhouette moved. She saw him from the stairs, stepped out onto the cobblestone courtyard where everything had once begun. "I came alone," he said before she could speak. "I know." Ethan hesitated, then met her gaze. "I want us to find a way back, for the baby's sake." Margaret said nothing at first, just looked at him. The man she'd once rocked to sleep during lightning storms, who now looked like he might break from the weight of his own indecision. "She's not well," he added. "But I'm trying. I need your help." Margaret's voice was soft but firm. "You didn't defend me, not once, even when you knew." "I was scared. I was exhausted, Ethan, and still I never once left you." He blinked rapidly, chest tightening. "So, is this forever?" Margaret tilted her head, the night air brushing against her cheeks like an old friend reminding her of the past. "I'll think about it," she said. Then she turned. "After the board vote." Margaret says, "I'll think about it. After the board vote." She branded me outdated. I gave the world timeless. She branded me outdated. Wrinkled, obsolete, unfit for the front of a lens. But I gave the world something else. Something no algorithm could fake. Timeless. The photo shoot wasn't planned to go viral. It was intimate. Shot in Studio A under natural light. No retouching, no marketing team, no production frenzy. Just Margaret, standing tall in her thrifted dove-gray wrap coat, hair swept into a soft twist, her brooch, Daniel's favorite, pinned near her collarbone. She stood against the original wall, the one she and Daniel painted together before the first client ever walked through the doors. Her hands folded gently. Her expression wasn't smiling exactly. It was sovereign. The photographer, a 23-year-old named Willow, barely spoke as she worked. Her camera clicked with quiet reverence. "You don't need to pose," Willow whispered. "You've already arrived." When Willow posted the image that evening on her small art account, she didn't expect anything more than a few supportive comments. But the next morning, it exploded. Studio Willow. 68. Fierce. Unfiltered. Margaret Holloway didn't ask for the spotlight, she just stepped into it. Within hours, it was reshared by feminist collectives, design magazines, even a major outdoor brand who captioned it, "The most powerful accessory is authenticity." A single black and white portrait, no hashtags, no Gloss, just a woman who refused to disappear. Inside the studio's new open gallery wing, Margaret stood beneath the portrait's framed print, now mounted above the welcome desk. A younger artist approached her, tattoos trailing up her arm, ink-stained hands, and tears held back behind round glasses. "You made it okay to age," she said. "No one ever told us we could do it and still be seen." Margaret touched her shoulder gently. "No one has to tell you," she replied. "You just have to show them." The same day, a courier arrived with a white envelope, thick and stiff. Isabel handed it to Margaret, her lips curled in a grin. "It's been drafted, signed, served inside, the official defamation and harassment cease and desist order addressed to Ms. Blair Holloway." Blair had recently posted a cryptic caption beneath a crying selfie. "Some people pretend they're survivors just to bury you alive." Comments had spiraled into speculation. Some accused Margaret, others defended her. Now, there'd be no speculation, just paperwork. Margaret slid the envelope into a filing cabinet and moved on. Ethan came by that evening. Not with groceries, not with apologies, just with clarity. They sat in Daniel's old office, now restored with new shelves, fresh coats of muted paint, and a simple quote above the desk: "Stay rooted, but never still." "I need space," Ethan said, "from Blair, from the mess, from everything." Margaret didn't flinch. He stared at his hands. "I keep asking what kind of man I've become, but maybe I need to ask what kind of son I want to be." Margaret rose and hugged him, not as a reward, not as an absolution, but as permission. Meanwhile, Blair sat alone in her subleased office downtown. Once filled with ring lights, mood boards, and prop plants, it now felt sterile. Then came the knock. A man in uniform handed her an envelope. Her hands shook as she opened it. Notice of commercial termination. All non-primary tenants of Holloway Creative Spaces are hereby ordered to vacate within 30 days per Clause B12. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The space she once used to build empires now belonged to someone else, and that someone had never needed hashtags to win. Blair receives eviction notice from her subleased office. "I never learned law. I just remembered loyalty." Margaret never studied law. She didn't need to. Loyalty had its own paperwork, stitched into handshakes, stained in coffee rings on napkins, signed in trust and time. And today, loyalty was about to become legally binding. The studio conference room smelled faintly of lemon oil and fresh ink. Sunlight spilled through the wide windows, washing across a polished oak table now strewn with contract folders, post-it flags, and one single page that Margaret had held onto for nearly a decade. She unfolded it now, smoothing the creases. "Clause 14C, she said calmly. Blair, seated across from her, looked up with dark-rimmed eyes and a tight jaw. Her new attorney, a sleek woman in navy silk with a sharp gold watch, frowned as she scanned the document. "What is this?" the lawyer asked. Isabel stood to Margaret's left, arms crossed but quiet. "It's a supplemental agreement," Margaret replied. "From the first year Blair began using the studio professionally, she wanted discounted access to the space for her first campaign shoot." "I was just starting out," Blair said defensively. "I was broke, and I believed in you," Margaret said. "So I offered access. On one condition." She tapped the final clause. The lawyer adjusted her glasses, rereading the line aloud. "In exchange for full subsidized access to Holloway Studio and facilities, the recipient waives future entitlement to ownership rights, profits or intellectual property claims derived from the physical or digital use of the space, present or retroactive." Silence dropped like a gavel. Blair blinked. That's not enforceable." The lawyer didn't speak. "Right?" she asked again, voice higher now. The lawyer finally looked at her. "It's enforceable," she said flatly. "And honestly, bulletproof." Blair's chair creaked beneath her as she leaned forward. "This isn't fair, you tricked me." "No," Margaret said, voice firm. "I trusted you to honor what we gave you, and you sold it back to the world like it was yours alone." By late afternoon, Blair was gone. The attorney didn't walk out with her. Margaret remained behind, sitting in silence as the final documents were scanned, logged, and sealed. The last contract she'd ever need regarding Blair Holloway. She opened her leather-bound notebook, the one Daniel gave her in 1996 when they pitched the first joint project. On the front page, she wrote in clean black ink, "The Holloway Foundation, nonprofit creative space for women 50+. The next week, the foundation launched quietly with a single photo on the studio's website. Not of Margaret, not of Blair, but of a young woman with a camera bag slung across her shoulder, braces barely visible behind her nervous smile. Her name had been Layla Jordan, studio intern number 001, unpaid, overworked, forgotten by most, but not by Margaret. She renamed the scholarship in her honor the Jordan Grant, for every woman who was told she was too late, too soft, or too invisible to matter. The final rebranding meeting happened in the main gallery, where all new public-facing materials were laid out. Business cards, digital banners, print ads, workshop flyers. Margaret flipped through each one slowly, then paused at the last portfolio mock-up. In the bottom corner, Blair's face still hovered, smiling in a branded shoot, untouched from an old file. Margaret looked at Isabel. "It stays in the archives," she said. "Not on the wall." Isabel nodded. "Understood." She clicked twice, and the image vanished from the screen. Outside, a group of women gathered in the courtyard, each with paintbrushes, sketch pads, and stories written in the lines around their eyes. They didn't pose, they created. Margaret stepped out to join them, the door swinging shut behind her with a satisfying click. No noise, no announcement. But something in the air felt different, freer. Blair's face is removed from all promo materials. "The last time I stood in this room, I was told I didn't belong." The last time Margaret stood in Studio C, someone had told her she didn't belong. Today, the room was hers, and there was no one left to crop her out. The lights were softer than the old rigs Blair once insisted on. These were warm, natural, window-diffused. The floor was stripped to polished concrete, the background a hand-painted muslin in shades of clay and charcoal. No props, no set dressing, just truth. Margaret stood in front of the lens dressed in a navy vintage coat she'd bought for $6 in 1993. The lining had faded, but the collar still sat high like it remembered its worth. Her trousers were pressed with care. The brooch, again, held everything together. There was no stylist, no glam team. Only Willow, the young photographer, her camera steady and her eyes full of quiet awe. "You ready?" Willow asked, voice soft. Margaret took one breath and nodded. Click, click, click. The shutter echoed through the studio like footsteps in memory. With each shot, Margaret's posture lifted, not just from poise, but pride. She didn't need to be youthful. She didn't need to be flawless. She just needed to be seen. Willow lowered the camera. "You know," she said, "I almost quit photography last year." Margaret glanced over. "Why?" "I got tired of shooting lies." Willow laughed, self-conscious. Plastic perfection, frozen smiles, clients telling me to Photoshop out freckles or slim the cheeks. I started to think maybe this wasn't art anymore. Margaret tilted her head, waiting. "But then you walked in last month, told me not to erase anything, said you'd earned every crease. That changed something." Willow lifted her camera again, blinked back something bright. "You're the reason I stayed in art." After the session, Margaret stepped into the gallery lobby where the newest installation was being mounted. Portraits of women aged 50 to 80, farmers, writers, bus drivers, caretakers, and grandmothers. No edits, no captions, just names. The Unfiltered Archive. Each photo bore a brass tag beneath it. Willow's shot of Margaret would join them soon. At the center of the display was a plaque carved from reclaimed studio wood. "Beauty is not the absence of time. It is the evidence of it." Margaret was halfway to her office when she heard the door. A familiar knock. Hesitant. 2 beats and a pause. She turned. Blair stood in the doorway, wind-blown and visibly thinner. Her once impeccable outfit was swapped for an oversized hoodie and leggings, hair tied up without effort. Her face was raw, not in makeup, but in expression. She looked like someone who had been spiraling long enough to realize the floor was cold. "Can I talk to you?" she asked. Margaret nodded just once. Blair stepped inside. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in front of her. I saw the photos, she whispered. The exhibit. I walked through it yesterday when no one was here. Margaret didn't interrupt. They're real, Blair continued. It hurt, because I think I finally understood what I've never been. There was silence, thick but not cruel. I lost everything, Blair added, but maybe I needed to, because for the first time I'm not pretending. Margaret exhaled. What do you want? Blair looked up, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. I don't want to take anything anymore, I don't know how to give back, but I want to try. Another pause. Then the question came, like a thread hanging from the edge of a fraying life. Is there any way back? Blair shows up. Is there any way back? They erased me from photos, but I became the frame they live inside. They erased me from photos, cropped my hands out of family portraits, cut me from their feed, but I became something else. Not just the picture, the frame. They live inside. Blair stood in the doorway, waiting for an answer. But Margaret said nothing. She didn't reject. She didn't forgive. She simply let silence fill the room. Thick, unedited, undeniable. Blair shifted awkwardly, like she wasn't used to conversations where she wasn't the center of the sound. I'll come back, she finally said, voice quiet, when I've earned the right to ask again. Then she turned and walked out, her shadow stretching long against the studio wall. That weekend, Margaret stood at the front of the exhibit. The doors opened at 10 a.m. Sharp, and by 10:07 a small line had already formed down the hallway. They weren't here for influencers. They were here for truth. The opening photograph, the image Willow had taken during that quiet afternoon shoot, hung in the center of the welcome hall, beneath soft lighting and a single line etched in brass. She didn't need permission to be seen. Margaret stood beside it, dressed simply, the same navy coat, the same brooch, her hair loose around her shoulders. A group of young girls entered in a small cluster, their hands linked, their excitement held just behind their teeth. They paused at the photo, whispering. One of them, a girl no older than 15, turned and said, wide-eyed, "Are you her?" Margaret smiled. "I am. Can we ask you something?" "Of course." The questions came like petals opening. "How did you stay strong when people ignored you? What do you do when your family doesn't see your worth? Were you scared to show your real face?" Margaret answered not with speeches, but stories. "I once sewed my own dress for a wedding I wasn't invited to. I forgave people who never said sorry because I didn't want their silence to echo louder than my peace. I wore grief like lace and dignity like pearls." The girls listened, eyes wide, some scribbling notes in tiny notebooks with stickers peeling at the corners. One asked if she could hug her. Margaret said yes. Across the room, near the side wall, Ethan stood alone. He didn't try to interrupt. He didn't ask for acknowledgement. He just watched. His mother had become something larger than legacy. She had become proof that erasure doesn't last forever. That voice returns when no one expects it. That some women aren't trying to reclaim power. They're simply remembering it was always theirs. He watched as another girl leaned in and said, "You make me feel like I don't have to rush, like I can age." Margaret brushed a hand gently over the girl's hair. "You don't have to chase time. It's already walking beside you." Later, after the gallery began to empty, Willow came up beside Margaret, holding a guest book filled with comments, doodles, and messages. "Thank you for showing us that soft isn't weak. You look like my mother, and I've never felt more proud of that. I stopped editing my photos today." Margaret flipped to the back. A final message caught her eye. No name, no signature, just 4 words written in firm, familiar ink. "You were always art." She didn't cry, but her breath hitched just once. Some truths don't need framing. As the final light settled across the floorboards, Margaret stepped back to look at the portrait one last time. She saw herself, not as an icon, not as a survivor, but as a woman who refused to fade. Her arms were at her sides, her chin slightly lifted, her wrinkles unblurred, her eyes full of a future she no longer feared. From behind the glass, she looked back at the world, and the world, finally, looked back. She didn't want me in the picture, so I made the picture mine.